Díomh go léir, anocht ihe cultúr fethe a héin. Agus tá an áthas orm fáilte allmhór a chu ribh ar gailteoir anocht, agus é sin Aogán Ó Fearghaíl a caint faoi Ardscoil Bhreifne. Agus tá gá ócáid iontach speisialta agan anocht, ag an níomh anocht by the Armagh Rhymers, a caint faoi bilingual poetry and music performance. A lot of poems that we learned at school. That's at 9 o'clock, immediately after this. Ach anish is mór an anadum fáilte allmhór a chu ribh Aogán. Is íor bhúnteoir Aogán, agus íor uachtar an Cumma Clas Gael. Agus a bhfuil ag obair anish leis an Institute Dernakesh a DCU. Is fear é a bhfuil sim go smúr aige san star áitiúil. Agus bhfuil a lán taide dénta aige thar na blianta. Anocht by Aogán ag caint faoi Ardscoil Bhreifne, Cavan's Irish College in Glangevlin from 1920 to 1924. Sí siarnish agus buan salt as an lecht iontach seo. Gormaga. Anish Aogán.
Gur míl maigad tearmal agus míle buchas as an cuireúirí seo chorla chun an Cavan as an leabharlann chun caint living up. Gaeltacht Bhreifne nó Ardscoil Bhreifne thugadú mar teigil don caint garage seo anocht, and I'll do my best in the brief period we have tonight to encompass a little talk maybe in a general way and honing in particularly on the period of Ardscoil Bhreifne and particularly maybe of many of the characters. Important to say that Gaeltacht Bhreifne, or I suppose a Gaeltacht, all of Cavan, all of Bhreifne was a Gaeltacht for about 2,000 years. We've been speaking English for about 200. And it's something that we should always keep, because those 2,000 years weigh heavily on our cultural influences and on our mindsets. We're specifically honing in tonight on Ardscoil Bhreifne because that was, I suppose, the area in Cavan which had the highest concentration of native speakers. A native speaker is defined as someone brought up with a language, mum, dad, it's the language of the home. And whilst there were native speakers in pockets right around Cavan into the 1920s, 30s and 40s, the highest concentration of them was in the Glangevlin area. And it's for that reason that when there was a Gaeltacht Irish college formed, it was to that area that they went. In general, looking through various sources, we find that in the Bhreifne area, we had a 70-year-old native speaker in 1942. In my own particular area, Kilmagibon, there were native speakers in the 20s and 30s. Not many, but some. And certainly the Kingscourt Muff area had a very strong Gaelic tradition and a few native speakers down to the 1920s. So we're very much into the 20th century in pockets of Cavan. 1946, the Anglo-Celt reports on the last native speaker of Irish, a 70-year-old in that Black Lion, Glenfarne area. And Seamus O'Dolan, who was a senator for many years, always maintained that he was a native speaker, that he always grew up with his mother speaking native Irish. Certainly his mother was a native speaker, and Seamus always used the tongue. So Glangevlin would have that distinction of being perhaps one of the last areas to have a landscape, as you see there, a beautiful landscape, but certainly a landscape close to the Irish language. The whole region is known and was known in Gaelic areas, Chalapna or Tullyhaw, but it was really the kingdom of the McHavron clan or the McGoverns. They used to say, throw a stone in Glangevlin, you'll hit a McGovern. And it's still true to this day. McGoverns, Dolans, particularly those names, and Maguire, of course, Sheridan, feature very strongly in the area. But it was the McGovern or the McGovern clan that held preeminence in that region. Probably a term that needs to be reassessed. We talk about nationalist reawakenings. In the 1900s, there was always a nationalist feeling. It didn't really need to be reawoken, but the interest in the Irish language was certainly, and in Gaelic and in cultural pursuits, strongly to the fore in Cavan and right around Ireland. I would posit the view that it was the founding of the GA in 1884 that was the trigger for much of that. There was now a great celebration in playing our games. And in 1886, we had in Cavan the first county final when we had the Ballyconnell first Ulsters facing off against the Bailieborough home rulers. And then the Gaelic League. In Cavan, it was formed in 1901, and it took off very rapidly, right across the county. But it was closely linked to a rising feeling of nationalism, and the language and the games, they were going hand in hand. And we can tell that very clearly from the files of the Anglo-Celt when we get the same personalities. You were chair of the local GA club and also perhaps the organiser of our Gaelic League, and then in a little later period perhaps a member of the Irish Volunteers. In 1910, Cavan had 12 branches of the Gaelic League, and I'm deliberately using the term Gaelic League because that's what it was known as. Today we call it Conradh na Gaeilge. But in the early years, just as the GAA, they always used the English form of their association. We had Feis Bhreifne, Feis Bhreifne, Feis Ramor. These were hugely attended events. And whilst there were language classes right across Cavan, there's particular emphasis of reports of very strong attendances in Winkela, Cúrsa, Caolan, Colig, Bailieborough, and in Bealach. So it was all across the county, but it was linked to the political excitement of the period. Glangevlin was not immune to any of this, but it was a little different because the language was still spoken on a daily basis. Whilst people were going to language classes from 1906 on in Cúrsa and in Cavan Town and learning the language, in Glangevlin that was also happening, but there was a strong cohort of people, particularly in the older age bracket, who were using the language on a daily basis. Glangevlin had a very strong Gaelic tradition. There was a bardic school there back in the medieval ages, and the language experts show us that wherever you had a bardic school right across Ireland, it enriched the language of the local people. There was a strong learning, there was a strong tradition of a wider vocabulary, of greater use of influences from around the world, or certainly from around Europe. And it did also enrich, and that's common particularly all across the Munster bardic school areas. And Glangevlin did have that. There's the Dúnra McGovern, or the McGovern text of 1598. And then, of course, the famous character that most people have heard of, one of Cavan's foremost poets, Cathal Bui McGilligunna. Probably anglicised MacElgun, still a name to be found. We cannot be sure. He was born in Glangevlin, but certainly in that area, in that region. And he lived somewhere around that area, and a lot of his stories continued into the folklore of the Glangevlin. And just to finish on this particular point about the richness of the native language, the census returns are revealing, but you have to always take them with a grain of salt. People They didn't really trust the census at that time and didn't like to give too much detailed information. But having entered that in caveat, still in 1901, there are 1,447 native speakers in Glangevlin. Now, we find native speakers in 1901 in pockets across Cavan, as I mentioned in a previous slide, particularly the areas that I've mentioned, but nowhere near that number of 1,447. In the 1911 census, it had dropped significantly. You see that it's down to 708. And even more alarming, in 1911, of that 708 who said they were native speakers, 403 of them were 60 plus. So we see that whilst Glangevlin was in the early part of the 20th century a Gaeltacht, where Irish was the living language, it was being largely confined to the older cohort. And in 1921, when a lot of language enthusiasts from Ireland came to the beginning of the Gaeltacht College, their estimates vary, but most would agree on a figure in and around that 150, that by 1921, there were around 150 people who were using Irish on a daily basis and were native speakers. Ardscoil Bhreifne, that notion was in the minds of many within the Gaelic League for about a decade, that they would do something, as they called it in some of their meetings. And with the 150 native speakers in Glangevlin, it was thought this was the most suitable place to locate a college. There was a great interest in it. The photograph is of a priest, and he was Father Micheál McLaughlin. He was a Leitrim man, and in Drumkeerdon area, had been a curate in Glan and collected much stories there and showed great interest in the language. Principal of Manor Hamilton School, served in Belturbet, and as a very young man in 1920 died at a very early age. and they wanted to commemorate him, the language enthusiasts particularly, and the Gaelic League within Cavan decided this was the time to push for a Gaeltacht summer school and to call it to host it in memorial of Father Micheál McLaughlin. There are many people always behind everything, but that one name that I have on the slide, Seamus O'Glasson, needs to be remembered. He was a full-time Gaelic League organizer. And it was Seamus O'Glasson who was I use that word advisedly. He was the organizer. He was the key driver. He was full-time. He was paid by the Gaelic League to organize language classes, which he did effectively throughout Cavan. But he put huge enthusiasm, energy, commitment. Seamus had been born in England of Irish parents and had returned to Ireland to fight in the rebellion of 1916. And if you note, as I go through this talk, you'll find that there was a lot of connection between Republican nationalism and the Irish language, and O'Glasson would be one example of that. He was fired with enthusiasm for the language and for the nationalist cause, and he, more than anyone, organized the many various groups to bring the groups together to organize the college. The college was being formed and started out in 1921. Glan Bar is still there. It's still a place you can enjoy a tipple. And it was in that premises that this teaching staff took lodgings. It was beside that premises that a marquee, which was on loan or on hire. I'm not sure which, whether it was ever paid for, I don't know, but it certainly came from Cavan County Council. And it was by their good offices that it was provided. And the Anglo-Celt said that it also would leak in rain on a rainy night. Across the road was Dolan's shop and post office. That's a recent photograph I took myself. That's all that's left of it, the photograph that you see there on top. But that's where much of the action took place in terms of organization. And also in classes and in open-air ceilidhs and in open-air events. This was the central point. And then 1924, probably the only remnant still there to this day of one of the benefits of a Gaeltacht college, the hall was built in Glangevlin, and that was directly linked to the college. And just briefly to mention, not teachers, and not coming from anywhere outside, but O'Glasson got huge support from certain Cavan people, and their names, some of them are listed there. Sean McGovern was a Glangevlin man. Many people knew him as the principal teacher for many years in Belturbet. Dr. James Stewart, also from a medical doctor in Belturbet. Seamus Gilheany, very prominent in GA affairs in Cavan County Board for many, many years. P.F. Baxter, prominent in politics as a senator and a TD. Andy McEntee. And Andy, and of course his family, right down to the present day, great journalists. Paul McShane, still have a bar in Cornafane, McShane's, and that's the same family. There were Johnsons, but he was Paul McShane. These were all very much fired up by the nationalist cause, but very much supportive of the Irish language. And Gerard McGovern and Thomas McKenna, I will come back to him a little later on, Father Rudden, and Father McGriskin, who was the curate in Glan. So these were all people on the ground who were part of the committee, who were organising and helping to make sure that this college would happen. The language was rich. It was described by a man, Thomas McConnelly, who wrote under the name of Cú Ulu, as one of the richest and easiest and most pleasant of all dialects. I'm just going to play a very short piece of a native speaker. This was recorded in 1931. This is Sean Eamon Rory McGeer. He attended the language classes when they happened, and he would speak to the students. But it's just interesting to listen to the Cavan accent speaking, and this was not from notes. This man didn't read Irish, he simply spoke it, and this was recorded in 1931. So it's just to give you a little flavour of the sound of Irish as spoken, not by someone who learned it, but by someone who was it as a native speaker.
Bóchal asadat a tógamise, póstal, le calling dash óg. Agus ni raise roada pósta, go hicte gon sinshin. Agus ni raise to be na doctory go. Well asan van óg, ma ya tis boss, the mission maru, Lowland. All je verder zinners en vaart, bij maar zinners. En ik zei dat een woord, ik werk in een gestuurd les, talk was tegen zogen. Agus behoorlijk de homne janu. Agus gonna hit ik agon Marie old. Je got a concussion or session bij je van ook, maar ook al woorden aan. Wel er session bij zogen de nog je hoku. Ik kon nog meer Franco aan mijn session. Er was one van mission of there. Was niet ook maar grainer achter le Gaeltacht. Er was lekker met stof en de berse andere dag horse. Agus bij tussen neer Cornel one agus ik in op in de Cornel lele. Agus naar de Deense goedation het jaarstag. Oh, aber het ze ben baas. Running fall maar de doortje. Agus lekker sprake kolle Franco. Agus diese sinu wanneer sie je man op. Agus krijgen van ook een law er kolle Franco. Agus die in zo het heel jaarstag voor het. Shit halen.
So that's Sean Eamon Rory Maguire, and that's a photograph also of his burial tombstone in Glangevlin graveyard, and he was one of the great Shanachis that was many collectors and purists of the language and scholars, sorry, of the language visited and listened to Sean Eamon Rory Maguire. Mentioned him a little earlier, and he is worthy of just a little further elaboration. That's Thomas Skinner McKenna, a very famous character. He was born Thomas Skinner, but in his research, he discovered quite rightly that the Skinner name is really a part of the McKenna clan of North Monaghan. It's only found in the Ardscoil area, so it's very much a Monaghan name. Thomas was born in Scotland. He returned to Ireland in 1916 to fight in the rebellion in Dublin. Following the 1916 rebellion, he was not a leader, so he escaped after the rebellion, and he wanted to continue learning Irish, but he wanted the South Ulster Irish. He was very specific. So he came to Glangevlin and found a Gaeltacht there, and it was that man, Thomas Skinner McKenna, that collected the prayers that the old people said, and he published them under the title On Padrin Parcha, that's the rosary, On Padrin Parcha agus Urniha Ella, and other prayers. So it's still available in Cavan County Library, and it's a lovely collection in Cavan Irish that he also wrote in the Anglo-Celt under the name of Unscholar a book. And just to mention finally on Thomas Skinner McKenna, Thomas McKenna's sister is an equally well-known lady. His sister was Margaret, and Margaret Skinner also fought in the 1916 rebellion, and she became president of the INTO, or the Irish National Teachers Organisation, in 1951. There's a roundabout in Monaghan town called the Margaret Skinner roundabout. So he was very much associated with setting the groundwork and for promoting the language and encouraging younger people to learn from the older people. So by the time we got to setting up the college, £300 had been donated. I asked someone who would know these things, and he assures me £300 is in and around 11,000 euro in today's money. So quite a lot of money was collected to help fund this new Ardscoil Bhreifne. And just to mention, there was a link and a very strong influence in another much more famous college further to the north. The first Irish language college in Ulster was College the Ulu, which is still there, no longer sadly operates as a Gaeltacht college, but it's still there in Gaeltacht in Donegal. And there was a huge, strong Cavan connection. You might see on the photograph over here, I hope I'm not hiding it, but that's the first principal there. You see I'm putting this thing around it. That's Una Ní Arcally, or Una Farrelly from Cavan, from the Bhreifne area of Mulla. And she was the principal of College the Ulu. Also in that photograph is another rather famous gentleman. There you see him seated, the bearded gentleman. That, of course, is Roger Casement, who was a student at the college. There was a lot of influences. A lot of the staff on the first, I will mention them by name in a little while, but a lot of the original staff were former pupils and were linked to College the Ulu in Gaeltacht. The course itself, in 1921, having set up their local committee, having got their teachers, and I will go through them and mention them in just a moment, The course itself was to begin on the 12th of July. That was the day the truce was to begin after the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War, or the Troubles, depending on what way you want to mention it. But it was to begin on the 12th, but because of the truce on the 12th, the 13th of July was the first day. And the first day of the course, we're told that there was great excitement and enthusiasm. The course began on the 13th of July, and 60 to 70 people. Difficult to get exact figures, but in and around that ballpark area, that's the number of students that registered for the course on the first day of the course. There was a second course then, the Cúrsa B, and that began on the 15th of August, and there were 100 people registered for that. So if you put the two courses together, in and around, 160, 170 people in a small area like Glangevlin, it was a huge influx, a bit like what does happen still in Gaeltacht areas when the summer courses come on. But it brings a whole new dynamic into an area, and it was an exciting time for people in Glangevlin, and that's the memory that a great many people have who lived or who are from the Glangevlin area and who remembered hearing it from their parents and their grandparents. There were also, of course, weekend visitors. When people would come, people who maybe couldn't get time off or whatever, and they would attend and attended at the weekends. Something happening to me here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, I'm just getting a problem with the screen share. Yeah, is that okay?
Yep.
Just very briefly, they stayed in houses. The house on the right, which as you can see is now a ruin, but that's one house that a great many of the students came to. So all these students that I mentioned, many of them were from the local area, so they went home. But in and around maybe 60% of the students that attended that first course in 1921, they took lodgings or digs or lochteen, as it was known as, which also brought an income, a welcome additional boost to the local families in the region for the duration of the course in that first period of 1921. The house on the left just is of interest. That's the Cúrsa house in Glangevlin. It's now a private residence, but it's an incredible structure when you look at it. In an area like Glangevlin, a huge house like that, but it was built by a famous Cavan man, very little or nothing, in fact, to do with the course, with the Irish language course, but Pat the Glan man, or Pat McGovern, he was alive and well at this time, and it was making millions in New York, and he's the man that brought the water from the Catskill Mountains to New York City, which still flows and still stands. Pat was a very generous benefactor, and he built that house for the people, for the curate in Glangevlin. Now, the teachers are of interest in the course in 1921. The principal, that's his photograph there. That photograph was taken when he was president of the Oireachtas. He didn't look like that in 1921, but he was a lifelong committed part of the Irish language movement. And in 1961, he was Uachtarán Oireachtas na Gaeilge, and that's when that photograph was taken. His name was Gilla Cristo Brin. Was the principal or the headmaster, also taught on the course as well as being principal teacher in 21. He was a native of Dunboyne in County Meath. His mother was a native Irish speaker. He himself went to school in Dublin and became a full-time organiser like Seamus O'Glasson for the Gaelic League or Conran Gaeilge, and then was appointed to the school by the Conran Gaeilge or Gaelic League. Princius Mac Stephen was a member of the Church of Ireland, and he went to Trinity College in Dublin and was a passionate Irish language and cultural nationalist. And he also, when he qualified from Trinity College in Dublin, he began to teach on a voluntary basis with the Gaelic League. And when he saw or heard through his Gaelic League associations that they were recruiting staff for a summer course, He applied and he was appointed to the staff. Princius O'Brien, or Francis O'Brien, of Cavan parents, born in Latin in County Monaghan, and he was a teacher in Dernakesh National School in Modibon, where I spent many years myself. And Princius O'Brien, when he was qualifying or learning as a student teacher, it was to College the Ulu that I mentioned earlier, where Unani Arkeli was the principal, that he attended. Maureen Gavron was the only teacher that was there all the way through, from 21 right through to the last course in 25. She was a native, she was a local. McGovern, of course, and Maureen Gavron was a national teacher native of Glangevlin, a native Irish speaker, always spoke, I was told, with beautiful Irish, and she was a national teacher then for many years afterwards in Swanland Bar. And then the final two are two sisters, Trasa agus Myra Nick Aogán, both natives of the Glenfin district area, Glanina, or on Gaeltacht law in Donegal. It's still a Gaeltacht. And the sisters were passionate Irish language enthusiasts and were also very much part of the Republican movement at the time. And Trasa Nick Aogán remained on the more militant side of republicanism, if I could put it that way, for the remainder of her life. Her sister Myra was much better known because she taught on the course in Glangevlin for the first few years, but in later years, for about 2 decades, she was the primary school inspector for most of County Cavan, and a great many teachers that I knew lived in fear of the visit of Myra Nick Aogán, because while she was obviously and always was a very professional and dutiful Kigura, the Irish language was always very much the only language she spoke, and it was always figured prominently. And many a teacher told me that she scared the daylights out of them on her visits to schools. Carama, just very quickly, I'll run through this, but I mean, you can see there, 10:30 to 3 o'clock, there were classes, there was singing, the usual that would happen in a Gaeltacht course today. On Friday, it was 10:30 to 1:30. There were lectures and debates. Because of the interest, a great many from College the Ulu visitors, Unani Arkeli visited, and so too did Ulu or Thomas McGunley. A number of different guest speakers would arrive, and there would be debates about various different matters and excitements, and some, not a great number, some of the local native speakers, but for example, Sean Eamon that I mentioned earlier, they would come along in the evenings and attend and speak to the students. And then there you would be Ceilís. The Ceilís in 1921 was one of the best summers that had been for some time, and all of these Ceilís were outside or on Bhreifne Spare. They would then visit the native speakers because most of them were old and were in their houses. But they welcome people, and there are great stories and reports, and I've heard many of them, of very late hours and early mornings had on the visits to the houses. So it was an exciting time, and it would usually also conclude with a sports day and a feis and various events associated with a prize giving. That's the photograph that sparked much of the interest in Ardscoil, Bhreifne. That was a photograph that Trasa Nick Aogán had in her possession, and she gave it to Seamus O'Morga. Seamus O'Morga was head of Irish when I was a student in College the Fádric or St. Patrick's College in Drumcondra in Dublin. And Seamus had when I was there, Seamus and I used to speak together quite a lot. I was a student, he was the teacher, but I remember him showing me that particular photograph. I knew nobody in it, but it was from that photograph that Seamus went searching and looking and finding and recording much of the information that we have on it. Some of the more famous characters there we see Prince Gilla Isa, that's the principal that I'm putting the arrow on, Gilla Isa. Beside him then Myra Nick Aogán, that's Father McGriskin, and that's Maureen Gavron, the only local or native. She was the Glangevlin teacher, and then Princius O'Brien. So a lovely photograph from the 1921, the rest are students of the teacher's course. I should say there were 2 courses, one for teachers, one for non-teachers, which sounded very discriminatory. That's Tully Casson School, School Náisiúnta Tulla Cassan Inniu, Marathache, ach eganam sin is an sin school sin a bhíor na rang and a Gaelge than a Moonchuri. The teachers' classes in the 1921 course took place within the walls of Tully Casson. It was a huge success. There was enthusiasm, there was excitement, all accounts from people who were there as teachers, from people who were there as students, students, reports that were written for the Gaelic League. And at that time, this was an era in the 1920s of report writing. Everything had to be recorded and reported. So all available evidence shows this was a great success. There was a great mix of the local students with the student body and a great number of visitors. So all in all, there was great hope for the language and for the Ardscoil in Glangevlin following Cúrsa in 1921. That's just a nice photograph. It's not a very clear photograph, but historic nonetheless, of 4 of the teachers in happy mode in 1921. Máire Aogán from left, and then Prinshias Mac Stefan. I mentioned Prinshias, the Trinity College graduate. That's the 2 Prinshiases. That's Prinshias Mac Stefan, and beside him with a cigarette in his mouth, Prinshias O'Brien. Francis O'Brien, or Prinshias O'Brien, as I said, at that time was teaching in Dernakesh. He later moved as principal to Lara National School and was remembered by generations of people, I'm sure to this day, in Lara, where he retired as principal teacher and maintained and kept his lifelong interest in the Irish language. And that's Trasa Aogán here on the extreme right. In 1922, Saoirstát Éirden, all is changed, utterly changed. Now we had an Irish Free State. The college was not operating in a different jurisdiction. It was now operating whilst we had a native ministry for education and for Gaeilge and for all the rest of it in Dublin. And some differences did occur. In 1922, the Free State minister was Eoin MacNeill. He, of course, was one of the joint founders with Douglas Tahija of the Gaelic League, but he announced in 1922 straight away that Irish would now be obligatory in all national schools 1 hour daily, and most of national teachers at the time couldn't speak Irish. So there were teacher courses in colleges all around the country, anywhere that there was a course, and the colleges were paid £5 per teacher enrolled. College the Ulu that I mentioned earlier blossomed. They came in their hundreds and hundreds, and it should also have benefited Glangevlin, but perhaps not to the same extent. The Gaelic League teachers were now moving from being employed by and paid by the Gaelic League to the County Council, really, or was known as the Technical Committee. They later on became the Technical Schools Committee, later became the Vocational Schools, and we now know them as the EFTs. So that the teachers were moving at that time into a different administration. Control was passing slowly from the Ardscoil Bhreifne to the state, passing from the Gaelic League because a lot of that enthusiasm and a lot of the fundraising that the Gaelic League had was moving from them. But yet, nonetheless, Feis Bhreifne, which was a fundraiser for a college, or Ardscoil Bhreifne in 1922, Arthur Griffith was the MP for East Cavan. He attended, and 4,000 people went there. But there were not a lot of hostilities in Cavan during the Civil War of 1922, but there were some, and some tensions, which did spill over to affect the college. Them teachers were back for the course in 22. The activities were similar. The chlorama, the enthusiasm was there. A lot of national teachers now who were really scampering to get to a course to improve their Irish for the new state's requirement of 1 hour teaching a day. There was lots of debates over the treaty, but I think it was overemphasized perhaps in some earlier studies, because most people would say at that time, most people were either just happy that the whole thing was over, happy enough with the treaty. Things changed later, but at that time there was very little division over the treaty, although there was some. For example, I mentioned the Aogán sisters. They were very much anti-treaty from the off, as was Pádraig Ó Dóileán, who was the local organizer of the accommodation situations, and the Free State troops did search the college, and Pádraig Dóileán and Trasa Aogán were arrested. They were later released, but yet it did cause resentment. 1923 course, and that's a photograph there of a well-known Cavan man, Liam O'Callagh. When I was a young teacher, I started teaching in 1979. Liam was alive and well, and I used to visit him regularly, and I spoke to him, not often enough, but I spoke to him on quite a number of occasions about Ardscoil Bhreifne. He came as a teacher to the college in 1923. But he would always say a number of things. He was a very honest man, and his reflections were very accurate and very good. A few things happened. First of all, I mentioned earlier Seamus O'Glasson. He left. He departed for a full-time principalship or headmastership in Bray with the vocational school there in 1923, and his loss was felt keenly. His enthusiasm and organisational skills were missed. He was replaced by a man from Belfast called Sean Aogán, and the teaching staff included Micheál Ó Cathain from Connemara Gaeltacht. His son Pádraig Ó Cathain was a well-known radio and Gaeltacht presenter for many years. Maureen Cavran that I mentioned, still there, and this man that I'm talking have the photograph of, Liam O'Callig. They had a similar programme. The only thing that most people remember that was different, they went on a trip to Bundoran. That's a feature of Gaeltacht life today. And in College to Ulu, they always had a trip. They would get a bus and travel. But the trip to Bundoran is remembered because they went on the back of a lorry. They couldn't afford or couldn't get a bus, and it was meant to be. There are many humorous stories about it. I put in one word at the bottom because I remember I asked Liam on one of the talks that I had with him about, I always spoke Irish, I never heard him speak English, but I'm sure he could speak English. But I asked him what happened, what really was the cause of the decline of the course. And the one word that sticks in my mind was, he said, "Vi skiltakta ignishandini." I didn't understand the word. I had to check Deneen's dictionary, but skiltaka was his Ulster Irish word for arthritis. And he maintained that by the time he came in 1923, the native speakers were confined to the houses and they were confined to the beds, that they were there, and he met them and he spoke to them. But because they had skiltaka or arthritis, they tended not to move out. So you didn't meet them on the roads. They didn't attend to the schools, and young teachers particularly were keen to have a course where they would hear native speakers. And it's always just stayed in my memory that Liam O'Callig's version of why the college didn't last was due to arthritis. A man who did a huge amount of work with Sean McGovern. Sean is pictured there, Sean McGovern. Sean was well known as a national teacher, principal of Belturbet Boys National School. And Sean had always been involved with the college as secretary of Bhreifne, secretary of the Glangevlin committee, and then from 23 on very much part of the organising of it. But from 23 on, tensions were beginning to creep into the running of the college. There was tension between the Gaelic League and the County Council. Who is responsible? Who's paying? Who will do? That type of thing. Little bit of indecisiveness. There was also some tension between Glangevlin and the rest of Cavan. The new county council, with its democratic mandate, began to say that perhaps some of the money being spent at Glangevlin should be spent in Ballybrin, Cúrsa, on classes there. So there was some tensions over that. There was also tension over Irish-speaking headmasters. Some of them could speak, some of them couldn't speak, and little divisions crept into the courses. Some had to attend, some didn't have to attend. Getting recognition for the college, McGovern and Sean there was largely responsible for that. The authorities, so the Dáil Éireann, recognised it as an official course for teachers, and that paid off hugely as a boost to the college that it had official recognition. There were adverts in the Anglo Celt for the courses in 23. The Feis Bhreifne did happen. Bhreifne Park was opened on the 23rd of July, and many references to the college. And just to say that there were 40 on the teachers course, they seem very round figures, and they are. It could be 41, it could be 79, but in and around 40 attended the teachers course, 80 attended the students course of 19 and 23. There was a little bit of money available in the new Dáil Éireann to help wherever you had a Gaeltacht and to help where you had a college, and they did help to build the hall that is still there, St. Patrick's Hall, Glangevlin. So a lot of the meetings, the national teachers were now very much part of it. The council was now funding. And then what I would say was a disastrous advertisement for the 24 course. In May, an advertisement looking for people to come to the course and use the word probably. Now, if you advertise today that this event probably will happen, you know what will happen attendances. And once the word probably got into it, things were not well. The new hall was opened. O'Glasson had moved on to Bray. O'Heachan had also moved on to Galway. And a new man came in the form of Alva O'Monaghan, also a Belfast man, great enthusiast, a great artist, as well as a great teacher. And he encouraged the wearing of the fáinne, but there were very disappointing attendances at the 24 course. Máire Nic Havron spoke to a man that I knew very well, PJ Shalvey, about it, and said that they were close to tears, really, because in 24 the attendances dropped. Teachers were flocking to Gaeltacht courses, but they were going to Mayo and to Galway and Donegal, and in particular a lot of Cavan teachers were going to College de Ulu in Gortha Horka. Gaelic, I mentioned Alva O'Monaghan, who had done great work and continued to do work. Particularly in 1924, the new Free State under Richard Mulcahy as Minister for Education, they decided that they should protect and promote and encourage the Gaeltachts, that there should be a designation for a Gaeltacht. And Alva O'Monaghan put a great folder together to make Glangevlin, or to have it recognised as a Gaeltacht. It's useful to us, of course, as historians, because we can read it and see the painstaking efforts he went to in chronicling it. But Alva, who's pictured here on the left, unfortunately, he was not successful, and Glangevlin didn't get Gaeltacht status, and it didn't even get Brack Gaeltacht status, which was partial Gaeltacht, because the number of speakers it had didn't meet the minimum requirement, and they were all, as I mentioned at the start, in that older age cohort. However, I mentioned Baxter. There he is, P.F. Baxter on the right. He was a pro-treaty Commoning Yale TD, then a senator later, but he had been involved in the college right from the very beginning. But in 1929, an act was passed called the Gaeltacht Housing Act. And even though Glangevlin, I suppose it was a political masterstroke, Glangevlin hadn't been given Gaeltacht status and wasn't included in the Gaeltacht, it somehow now, through his good work, became part of the Gaeltacht Housing Act. So if you built a house in Glangevlin from 29 onwards, you qualified for a grant as in a Gaeltacht area, which was of great benefit to the locality. 1925 is the last year that we have a Gaeltacht course under the auspices of Ardscoil Bhreifne. By now, it had moved from Gaelic League to full technical committee of the Cavan County Council. They were the organisers of the course. But they also ran similar courses in Cavan Town and in Ballybra. So the effort was now being spread across 3 centres. Death and emigration were largely put the reasons why, without using any emotional language. It just happens. Death and emigration took the native speakers away. Máire Nic Chearadain was still there Máire Nic Chearadain, McGovern was the teacher that was still there, but Máire Nic Chearadain that I mentioned from Gola is of good interest in our knowledge of the language from the area. She won the scholarship that year as the best student attending the course. And Máire Nic Chearadain, or in English, Sheridan, she came from Gola townland, and her grandfather was Dan O'Sheridan, or Dan Sheridan. And in 1912, a well-known language expert, O'Sharkig, collected much folklore and much of the Irish language traditions from the Gaeltacht in Glangevlin, but it was primarily from her grandfather, Dan Sheridan, that she collected and wrote a lot of the language. Her nephew was a well-known priest in the Diocese of Kilmore, Father Dan Sheridan, and he's not long dead. Father Dan's brother, Paddy, is alive and well, and a man I speak to on a very regular basis. And Paddy collected a lot of words still in use when he was a young man growing up in the 1950s and 60s in Glangevlin. So we have a lot of modern words that are still in everyday use, collected by Máire Nic Chearadain's nephew. And Máire Nic Chearadain's grandson, Cuan O'Sheridan, is now very much a prominent full-time worker with Conradh na Gaeilge. He's not the chief executive, but he's the next next level just immediately below that. And Cuan is a fabulous young man, a wonderful speaker of not native, but sounds perfectly, soft Ulster Irish. So that Sheridan family of Gola had a very strong connection with the Irish language in Glangevlin. There were less native speakers in 25, the Brack's Gaeltacht status had been refused, and the money was now being spread across a bigger age. Alva O'Winnacan, in his report to Gaelic League for their annual meeting, their annual congress, said that the Gaeltacht in Glangevlin was dying, and he used that little phrase at the bottom, Bos Shani Shugazumrika, death, old age, and emigration. And that was what he wrote in a contemporary note at the time as to the reason why Ardscoil Bhreifne was coming to a close. So they had a successful course in 21, in 22, an okay course in 23, not a very good course in 24, and certainly a loss-making course in 25. And after that, Ardscoil Bhreifne came to a close near Lanshe Ahilla. It was a time when all the little small Gaeltacht areas were under pressure. Glangevlin hadn't got their Gaeltacht status. The Ardscoil Bhreifne came to it ceased operations. But it's just interesting to note for comparison, in 1926, there had been a Gaeltacht course in Omeath in County Louth, and it also ceased in 1926. And Father Murray moved the college. It was College de Bhreifne, it was called, and it was moved to the Ross's Gaeltacht in Donegal, where it still continues to this day. So it wasn't only Glangevlin, it was other pockets of small Gaeltachts throughout the country that were also under pressure. Much of the information that I've gathered over the years came from Seamus O'Morga. He had published in Bhreifne in 1990 and 1991. Seamus O'Callig, whom I spoke to on numerous occasions, one of the teachers. I mentioned Pádraig and Cuan Ó Sheridan, both still living in Dublin and very prominent proponents and activists in the Irish language movements. And when I was a young teacher, the older teachers of that period, PJ Shalby, Sean Gallagher, Paul McManus, they all had remembered Sean McGovern, for example, Owen McGovern, Moira McGovern, all these teachers that they had spoken to and had heard little bits and pieces from them. Bishop Francis McKiernan had much information, of course, on the prayers and on the collections of Irish from the area. Seamus O'Dolan, I didn't get to speak to him enough, but I got a little bit of snippets from him on it. And all of their reminiscences are generally available in Lowerland on Conde. So, Míle Bhuíochas, Tásúlagam gur bhainse taithneamh. I hope in some way we try to throw a little light on what was a fascinating period. But of course, on the signposts of Béla O'Connell and Willan on Earden and on Black and whatever other ways, let's not fight about the right way or the wrong way. It's Irish, it's language, it's there. And even through the place names, we can still commemorate and remember the people who gave us the Ardscoil Bhreifne. So, Mhuíochas Arish agus Sinead.
Gur a míle mágat ag an bhí sin a ráwas. Just by Dernakesh agin inis on Hogo Furignev specialty on Scoil, or what kind of a building did they start out with for Ardscoil Bhreifne?
Well, they started out in a shed beside Dolan's. I showed Dolan's earlier in a slide, and also at the Glan bar in a marquee that was erected there. But in Tullycastle National School, they had the original courses. So between Tullycastle in 1921, it was Tullycastle School and in barns, sheds beside Dolan's and what's now Glan bar. But similarly in 22. Now, when you got to 23, the RIC were gone. There was a large RIC barracks in Glangevlin, and it was used. So the teachers got into the barracks. I'm sure they were delighted with that. They weren't detained against their will, I hope. But the RIC barracks was gone. The Gardaí hadn't used it. So it was used for classes along with Tullycastle School. So Tullycastle School remained and was the constant as a location. The hall then was built in 1924. And the hall was of great benefit. Unfortunately, by the time you get to 1924, as I was pointing out, sadly, the college there was in decline. And they used it in 24 and they used it in 25 for classes and, of course, for the Céilte. It was a wonderful hall, very appropriate to the needs of the course, but it came a little late. And the last thing just I'll say on that, Carmel, is the whole course came too late. If you were 1921 was probably 10, 15 years too late. Had they tried to establish a college, perhaps, when there was a bigger population of speakers, 1901, 2, 3, 4, 5, that period, and had they a hall at that stage, things may have been different.
And is Tullycastle close to Glangevlin?
Yes. It's part of the disparate rural community. You've got, I showed you there earlier, Glan Bar, and you just a very short, maybe a kilometre or a little bit less, 800 metres to a kilometre of a walk to the national school.
Yes.
If just to mention, just to mention, Aogán, that in between 1911 and 1921, you mentioned that there was a drop in numbers.
Yes. Sorry, Jonathan, between 21 and
between 1911, I think, and 1921.
Yeah.
There was a bit of a drop.
Oh, there's a significant drop. Yeah, from 1901, the census returns on the census form in 1901 and in 1911, you were asked to indicate your proficiency in the Irish language, just as you are today. And it have from 01 to 11. There was a significant decline. Not all of them died. Emigration. There were as many Glangevlin. I met people who in bars in London used to find that on Friday night, people were always speaking Irish. And they weren't all from Connemara. I remember one man telling me that he remembered meeting a McGovern man from Glangevlin who joined in with the Connemara men. So emigration and old age, and the language was declining, of course, because economically, and the state, it was not part of, it wasn't seen as valuable. It was seen as belonging to the poorer areas, and the older people spoke it. Sean Eamon Rory spoke it to the day he died to his brother, but not to his children.
I suppose, would that have to do with people who are emigrating, and when they were abroad, then they were going to, I know even my mother, and she's 96 tomorrow, went to an all-Irish school, and when she went to America, she could not count in English. I suppose maybe that's where that came from, but it's a pity. She still has a wonderful graph for the Gaeilge.
Yeah. But the sound, when you listen to the speaking voice of Sean Eamon Rory, even without a proficiency in Irish, it suits, the Irish language suits the Irish accent. It was designed for speaking Irish, and it's lovely that we have those recordings, which were recorded by a German collector.
Yeah. Did the pupils have to pay for the classes?
They did, and it's amazing. That's a different study now, and sociology students are examining that. Pre-independence, they were quite happy to pay it and fundraise for it. But once we established a state, we wanted the council to pay for it, and it changed, and the dynamic was moving. But they paid a fee. It largely depended on how much had been in the fundraising. So they paid very little, but there was a fee being paid, and there aren't records to show exactly how much they paid, but they did pay in the year. They paid nothing certainly from 23, 24, 25. That was being funded from the council. The new Free State government in 1922 passed a law in the Dáil that all councils would, in the rates, strike a rate of 1 penny in the pound for the promotion of the Irish language. And that was substantial finance, and it was substantial money, and it did lead to rows. And that's why it wasn't all being spent on Glangevlin, because councillors from other parts of Cavan were saying, well, why is that all going into can we have a slice of the pie? And that's where all this began to fall apart when well, not when the funding happened, but the primary reason for the Ardscoil Bhreifne not continuing was quite simply that the Gaeltacht itself was disappearing from under their feet. The native speakers were declining, they were confined to the houses, and the whole enrichment of language experience in a Gaeltacht is listening to and hearing native speakers, and they simply weren't there. And nowadays there's a much more enlightened approach taken. The main work of Údarás na Gaeltachta is not the promotion of the language, it's the promotion of jobs in Gaeltacht regions to ensure that people can economically survive in the Gaeltacht areas. And when there is employment and you have young people and an economy, the language tends to flourish with it, and there are lots of examples of that. Sadly, in Glangevlin, immigration was really the only outlet, because a great number of families have survived successfully on farming, but it was challenging.
And there were large families as well.
Very.
But yeah. And is there any evidence of the Irish language being spoken in East Cavan?
Well, not as far on. In the Kilmagibon area in the 1870s, 1880s, it would have been what you today might call a Brac Gaeltacht. The Muff area around Kingscourt, and various little parts. Seamus O'Morgan, that I mentioned earlier, certainly showed that in the Castlerahan area outside of Ballyjamestuff, that there was a pocket that continued afterwards. The Irish language was widely spoken, to summarise it very, very quickly, in 1800. Apart from the towns where English was always spoken, towns like Cúrsa, for example, Kingscourt, English was spoken in the towns, commerce and other reasons for that. But in the rural areas from 1800 right up to famine times, Irish was the primary language in Cavan of the rural classes. The famine took away the non-landed artisans, and they were Irish speakers. They were the Gaelic speakers. So when whole families were disappeared, either through death or emigration during the famine, it was the language that was gone and disappeared with them. The language declined rapidly. Some people used to mistakenly feel that languages die out slowly. They don't really. They'll disappear in a generation. And the parents in the 1860s and 70s had Irish, but they tended not to speak it to their children. Once they went to the bilingual state, it wasn't spoken. So by the turn of the century, it's pockets here, pockets there, and declining.
Sorry, there's a bit of interference there, Aogán. I was just going to ask, just in terms of dialect, was there much of a difference?
Yeah, very interesting, very, very interesting topic, which is being examined more and more all the time. Look at everywhere, there's never black and white, there's always grey, but grammatically and Fowriacht, as in pronunciation, it was an Ulster dialect. Ulster was the primary influence. There was also echoes of Connacht in it, but it was really, it was a South Ulster dialect in a different way, more like for language enthusiasts, the language of Gorta Hark and Gaidor perhaps would be a little bit stronger. If you're familiar with the language in South Donegal, it would be much closer to what we today would, the language around Glan Killa and that part of Donegal, Teelan, Glen, that area, it would be very like it when we listen to the recordings, but you can tell even from our place name pronunciations, it was an Ulster dialect, and it had some Connacht echoes certainly, but the grammar of the way that Sean Eamon and Rory would speak it was of that Ulster. It was an Ulster Connacht.
Yeah, the Feshes were a wonderful asset over the years. When did they kind of die out?
Yeah, well, Feshes continued, I suppose, right down, would it be 50s perhaps, but they tended, they were still quite, the Irish, the dancing, the dancing moved in a different direction from 30s, 40s. Then we had the war, which sort of put a pause on things. The war, or the Second World War, was a bit like COVID. It sort of paused activities. And after World War II, Irish dancing changed, particularly. Irish dancing, you know, they went into costumes, they went into different stylistic, indoor and different forms. That tended to move away from the outdoor, more free, laissez-faire style of the feis. So the feishes were declining by that stage, as the music was also, until Cultus came along and with the Flatheol idea and brought the music back to the great outdoors. So, you know, but the feishes were big in the 20s and the 30s and were very large gatherings of people. But like a lot of events, cultural events, it's the gathering, it's the coming together, it's the big coming of the feis was always an exciting event. But I would say, Carmel, really just after World War II, you find that the feis is in steep decline, and we moved into halls. Bit like handball. We had handball at every crossroads when we had outdoor open walls, and then we went modern and we went indoors and died.
Yeah, well, it's amazing. I remember the feis now in the 70s. Banu Rahali in Ballygymstuff, she did amazing work. She sent hundreds of youngsters to the Gaeltacht Coláiste Ulla, where I went myself on occasion as well.
Good.
And it was just amazing.
Yeah.
You know, to spend that 3 weeks and 3 days, and the competition kind of, it was outside it was probably in what's the football pitch in Ballygymstuff now, where there were different moon tours kind of at cars kind of, and they asked you a number of questions and you had to do your little bit of poetry or whatever. And but it was an amazing asset to people at that time. Like, I mean, I think we paid maybe just for the price of the bus going. That was it. When you compare that with the cost of going to the Gaeltacht today. But she did amazing work in the Ballygymstuff area, and really that whole hinterland there, you know, in the 70s.
I worked as a teacher for many years in College to Ulu, and I remember going through the archives, and in 1964 an instruction on their leaflet for the students was that by Aogán Ó Fearghaíl las mue mas dinyan kai kota. In other words, we'll have a céilí. If the weather's good, it'll be outside, and if the weather's bad, wear a coat.
Lord God. Oh my God.
So they were going to be outside. They were going out anyway, and you know, we're moving back to that now again.
Yeah. Everything comes full cycle, and you know, in some ways, not a bit harm. No, that was just amazing, Aogán, as usual. Just so informative, and just
did the
amazing
recording and
delivery.
technical end work all right? It did.
Yeah, Gahintak. So, Inish Neil Falk, a couple of Falk, Jonathan, Makwalaki and Shaw. Jonathan. Yeah. Kincha.
Again, just thank you, Aogán, for a most inspiring and informative talk. We could have listened for another hour or so. It was very, very interesting. And just continuing with tonight's events for Cavan Library Services Culture Night. Next up, we have the Armagh Rhymers with the Mummer Lines bilingual poetry and music performance. And for the link to this evening's event, see Cavan Library website and Facebook page. Gura Mahav, Lagwiv.
Slán.
Gurmíle